Okay, I mean, I think the first thing that we should talk about is, and it's a question I get asked a lot, and I'm sure you guys do too. It's like, well, how many books do you have to sell to have a bestseller? Well, let's define bestseller. I mean, I would like to think that if you're on the Publishers Weekly bestseller list, that you would all be very happy with that, and you would be. But I think we have to recognize that what we're talking about mostly when we say bestseller is the New York Times bestseller list. Is that fair? Good. Argue with me.
Well, no, the thing about the Publishers Weekly bestseller list, for those of us who follow very closely, is that it includes the practical nonfiction, a lot of the how-to books, which sell actually at such a great rate that a lot of the other nonfiction books can't get onto that list. So that's the only difference between the two. New York Times bestseller list divides the books so that narrative nonfiction is separate from practical nonfiction.
Because the Times has this miscellaneous how-to list, and we just put it all together. So, so different books bubble up. I mean, if you do compare the lists, for the most part, for certainly for fiction, I mean, they're very, very similar. You'll see the top 5 books are almost always the same. You might, number 3 and number 4 might, switch places. But then there are some surprises, and I think it's worth saying that. In this country, we do not publish hard numbers of sales, how many books are sold, and so all lists are relative. And that's sort of the first part of my answer to the question about, how many books do you have to sell to be a bestseller? Well, it depends. It depends who else came out with a book that week. It depends, as John just said, if it's a list that includes how-to books, which generally sell in much greater quantity, and you've written a narrative nonfiction, you're going to probably have to sell more books to get higher up on the list because you have a different kind of competition. So the short answer is there is no number, and yet a book can sell 5,000 copies in a week and get on the list. Mm-hmm. Depends on the week, right?
Near the bottom of the list, there are sometimes books that appear on it for only a week or two that in the aggregate don't sell very many copies and probably are not even perceived as that successful, but they sell at a very high velocity for just a week or two.
Right. And then there are books that never make it onto the list.
That sell at a smaller level but over a very long period of time.
For years and years and years. I mean, a lot of backlist books. I mean, you'll see around graduation time, you'll see that Dr. Seuss book come up on the list. Because it's a great graduation. All the places you'll go, right. And the rest of the year, I'm sure it sells very well. I mean, you don't see The Great Gatsby on the list very often, but it sells at a nice clip. You don't see To Kill a Mockingbird, or what my 14-year-old calls How to Kill a Mockingbird. It's the 21st century version. You don't see that on the list very often, but it's, it sells consistently through the, so.
Right now, everybody's saying that the list is very soft, and it's quite easy to get on it because there isn't that much traffic in the stores. So it's easy to get on, but there is so much competition because there are big books coming out all the time, so that you might get on the list, even if you are a household name, but you won't be on the list as long as usual. Let's say a David Baldacci, who might have been on the list last year for 10 weeks, this year might only be on the list for 4 weeks because Stephen King or someone else as famous is going to drive him off. So the list is very fluid.
What is aside from the obvious accolades and the pleasure of seeing your name on the list, are there actual benefits, financial, creative, career benefits from being a best-selling author?
I think there definitely are. I think that as with many things in life, including our present economy, if I can stray off, I think that you can find a lot of haves and have-nots in the publishing industry. There are fewer people in sort of the middle zone, and more people concentrated either with very modest sales or with enormous sales. And I think that being on the bestseller list tends to be a self-perpetuating thing in terms of having more display presence in the stores, which in turn begets more sales. And I do think it could increase your price for your next book, just in terms of the cachet that you add to the publisher's list.
I worked with a colleague who was very wise, and he'd been in the business for about 50 years, and after trying to intellectualize the whole thing, I realized that it all came down to what he said, which is that people like to read what other people are reading.
Okay, so everybody here has been involved in some way or another, either as an editor or publisher or a publicist, with many, many, many bestsellers. So what's the secret?
There is no secret.
That's the secret. There's no secret.
I mean, I think, as we've spoken before, I think if there was a secret, we would all be doing it more. And
Intense visualization.
Exactly. A lot of praying. No, I think it's a lot of luck, and I think it's a lot of publishing what you believe in. And I like to think that if I had nothing to do with the book that I work on, and I walked into a store and saw it, would I buy it? And that's the kind of book that I edit, and I like to edit, and it's the kind of book that I hope will sell. And you just hope that there are enough like-minded people who follow suit. But everybody has a well-intentioned book that you put out, and it's a great book, and the company gets behind it, and it just doesn't do well.
I mean, I think if I can give a slightly more cynical answer, I like to believe in my books too. I try to, but I do think that I wish some of the best and my favorite books that I've worked on did not sell very well. And I think that if I look at the commonality to a lot of the books that were bestsellers, a lot of them were by celebrities or famous people. And John could probably speak well. He's one of the few editors out there who has consistently published a lot of books by people who are maybe writing sort of real serious books that have cracked the list, which is really the holy grail, I think, the hardest thing to do. I think if you study the list, you're going to see predominantly it's going to be people who are talking heads on television and who are familiar presences from Oprah, or who are already sort of household names before they hit the list. I'm sorry, I should say that I'm talking about the nonfiction side, because I publish nonfiction. And I always rejoice when I see something that's a great reading experience that has broken through where that's not the case. But it's really, really challenging and difficult to do that with people who are not already very well known.
Okay, I'm going to make you tell the story about the Barack Obama book.
Well, make John talk a little bit first.
Oh, you want him to talk first? Okay, I was going to get to you next. Please,
Okay.
go.
You sure you don't want to do Barack? Do Barack.
Okay, I'll do
No,
that.
I don't want to hear it.
But then you're next, John.
Well, I mean, but that's a case, I guess, where I got pretty lucky.
Okay,
There was a
but
lot of
I think that's-
serendipity involved with that. I was relatively new to Crown. I had joined them in late 2003. And therefore, I was in that happy period before, as an editor, you're grievously overworked, and I didn't have a lot on my plate, and had the time to sort of luxuriously troll around and look to discover great projects. And I read about this very interesting politician who had just won this 6-way primary and impressed a lot of people in Chicago, and was just sort of getting the first very positive press with people saying that he seemed like someone to watch, and read about his life story, which sounded interesting, and got the idea that maybe it would be a good investment to see if he had a book in him. Maybe he would go someplace. And I found, to my amazement, not only had he written a book, but it had been published by my company years before, and it was out of print, and we controlled the rights. Oh my! Just sort of like, what are the odds of that? And so I approached him to write a preface to it, which he did, and that too was very lucky because of being able to work with him on that, I was able to establish a relationship with him, which later would make it possible more easily for me to buy his next book. And that was in March of 2004, and in July of 2004 he gave his speech to the DNC, and after that Barnes & Noble, which had ordered, I think, 3,000 copies, which was not terrible, of this book by this then relatively unknown person, increased their order to 20,000 copies, which they have since then have gone on to sell many, many more copies than that. I would be lying if I said that I could predict that. I certainly hoped he would go places, and I thought he had a special quality, but I didn't know that would happen. So I don't know what that proves about anything.
That it's a combination of smarts and luck and a lot of things.
But you were saying, you should have an instinct about go after, and I read that book, and it was a phenomenal book. I mean, he is really someone, Jacob Weisberg of Slate, once wrote about him in an article for, I think, Men's Vogue. Wrote an article where he said it's more like a writer who became a politician than a politician who became a writer. And he is really a superb writer, and he writes his books himself.
You could see that in the race speech just the other week.
Yeah.
It was such a well-written speech.
Yeah.